Good morning and welcome to Frank's School. 127th day of the 6-year first video. I'm going on with Hydra, and I want to talk about a thing I've named called Hydra Shock. Hydra Shock. Before I get into that though, let me just deal with this. Yesterday I was talking about artists and where are they? They're needed. I left out video game writers. There's a kind of writer that are extremely influential, clearly, and I know almost nothing about the genre. But the closest I know that anyone has stepped forward for the purposes that I can imagine is Eric Asadorian, I think it was, added a part to Settlers of Catan, I think it was, where the video game began to be actually somewhat realistic in terms of energy use. I think, I'm not prepared to speak on that, but anyway, they could help, and not only the writers, but then those that produce, and of course they feel they have to make money. The name Charles Eisenstein was just I might have run into him before, possibly, but his name was drawn to my attention again just this morning, actually, by Jonathan Fair. He said, "Hey, I forgot about him. You ought to check him out. He's an American," and I probably will, but these are terms, and that's what Hydra has been doing. We've been coming up with names, a tangle of nouns, and little by little I'm going to leave Hydra behind, actually. Anyway, what I want to talk about here is this term, lifestyle packages. I think the name is Brian Davey. I think he's the author. I could have got it for sure, but when I was reading In Defense of Degrowth, one of the criticisms fielded was by Brian Davey, and in the process of his eloquent writing, really, he referred to lifestyle packages, meaning, or how he was using it was, as degrowth occurs, as it certainly will, whether voluntary or involuntary, it will occur. People are going to have to adjust their lifestyle. And what I found interesting there, I mean, that maybe is obvious, is that the family can't have 3 cars. It has to share a car with the neighbor or something like that. Yeah, but he was also pointing out, or quoting a source that pointed out, that when that's done, that's traumatic. Not only because you lose things, but when you go into an unfamiliar way of doing things, you change your habits, you change your daily schedule, as he pointed out, then you have to think more about, well, how are you going to do it? There's more mental effort. You just don't do things automatically. Just hop in the car and run the kids to the soccer game and sit there and watch them. You have to think. And that is a trauma. And you might think, oh, that's lazy, go ahead and think. No, it's not that easy. Established cultures do so much of the thinking for you. What are you going to... I think I knew that, but it was drawn to my attention, and I'm devoting a video really to this. It reminded me of a book called Future Shock, which I think came out about 1970, in which the author was pointing out that there had been so much change so fast in the 20th century that people were suffering shock. I think of my grandfather often, who, when he was a little boy, it was horse and buggy only. There were no cars at all. His memories would have been before the turn of the century. Well, yeah, right around the turn of the century, around the year 1900. And by the time he died, men had landed on the moon. The internet existed, but I don't even know if he knew what that was by that time. He lived into his 90s. But anyway, you didn't have to live that long. Even if you lived a short time, there was a shock. So I don't own a cell phone. I never have. Someone has to remind me, how do you actually work this thing? That's an example of me voluntarily, I suppose, resisting future. Well, anyway, there's a book about it called Future Shock. And when I looked into that, I then ran into the word culture shock, which I'd forgotten the term. I mean, that's a well-known term, culture shock. When you move into a different culture, or you leave your culture, there's a shock effect. you know, I'm thinking of the Peace Corps at the moment. When Peace Corps volunteers came back, there was this readjustment allowance, money set aside to help them deal with that they had lived in another culture, and then when they came home, there was going to be a shock. And oh yes, there was. Vietnam veterans certainly could be said to have suffered culture shock when they came home. And some people experience in small ways. I've tried to wonder, is there anybody who never experienced culture shock? Probably not. But somebody born and raised in their hometown and staying all their lives in their hometown and taking a job where their parents had worked before, they might minimize culture shock. Well, anyway, in my own personal case, it sort of was an eye-opener because I thought, whoa, that's what I have suffered tremendously from culture shock in the last 2 or 3 years. Probably my heart problems had to do with it, because I began to actually live the life that Hydra had right along convinced me that was the right thing to do. But that's not easy. You know, skills, for example. I mean, try to garden without gasoline. It can be done. It's been done for thousands of years, of course. But that takes skills. And how do you do it? And you have to think about it. And you get stuff wrong. You know, in a sense, you're not prepared for that. And the infrastructure. Now, when they talk about infrastructure, people always think about concrete bridges and railroad lines and power grids and all the infrastructure. But there's also a question of infrastructure on the farm here locally. You know, fences. You know, I got goats because I realized I'm going to have goats. If I'm going to, otherwise everything will just go completely out of control, because this business about gasoline or diesel, there's a part of me, a lot of me, that feels that that's basically immoral. If you know what I know, and many other people know, about the climate change and global warming and stuff, you know that you're basically doing a arguably immoral act if you use a gasoline-powered engine. And I knew that. And so after retirement, my deciding to live according to those values made for tremendous shock. You know, how do you, you know, so I knew, I needed goats. But what about the fences? Well, part of me doesn't even like an electric fence. Well, a lot of me doesn't like an electric fence. So how do you fence? You got to have your fences. Who's going to build them? That takes time. How do you build a fence without just running an electric fence? And even an electric fence isn't that easy with goats. But anyway, the tools. You need tools. You know. Now I have a lot of tools. That's true. The pens. When I, you know, they weren't ready. They had to be built to manage the few cattle that I still had and to get ready for the goats. All of this was infrastructure, and I've been dealing with it basically almost alone, but because it was right. And then how do you build? How do you build if you have no money? Well, there's ways. People have built, for thousands of years with no money. But how do you do that? You know, your regular carpenter, he's got his compressor there and his power nailer and all these tools with batteries and sheetrock and plywood and the lumber shipped across the continent, and I mean, and concrete. You know, the energy wasted or degraded into greater entropy through the use of. I was aware of this stuff. But how do you actually do the building? Well, I found a way. I've managed to do this. I've survived this culture shock so far, and I think I will. You know, butchering. I don't really know how to butcher. I had to put a cow down because she was so old. It would have been inhumane to ship her. You know, so what do you do? And so I put her down. That part was not. That was humane, absolutely. But now what do I do? You know, if I were a butcher. But I'm not. You know, there's just so much to learn. Well, let me go back to this guy. People are liable to experience something like that almost universally as their culture changes around them, as degrowth occurs, which, as I'll say again, it will occur. There's no doubt about that. And quite a bit of argument. Is it going to be voluntary or involuntary? How fast? And there's argument about that. Well, here I thought I was going to be brief today, but I wasn't brief. But anyway, eventually I'm going to be leaving Hydra sort of behind, but I'll tell you about that next time. Bye for now.